Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michael, and on behalf of Whale Coast Conservation, a very warm welcome to you all this evening. I hope you're keeping safe. I hope you are well. And we're very excited to host Alex van der Heever tonight, talking about the ancient art of tracking. I do just want to remind you that next week we have a wonderful talk titled Fighting Nature with Nature with Jonathan Howell. He has spent 30 years working with owls. He's a bit of an owl expert, and with bats. And he's going to be talking all about how these creatures are keeping nature in check, looking after the rats and the mice and the other pests, not only in South Africa, but all over the world. For those of you who've missed the previous conversations, all of these talks are recorded. And so you can see them on YouTube and on Facebook on Whale Coast Conservation platforms. So you're welcome to share these with people who might not be joining us this evening. And now over to you, Alex, in the Midlands of KwaZulu-Natal. How are you this evening?
Good, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Michael.
So, Alex, will you start in the beginning? How did you get into helping to preserve this ancient art? Have you always been a tracker, or where did it all start?
Yeah, no, I was not always a tracker. I grew up on a farm outside Plettenberg Bay, between Plet and Knysna, but I was lucky to visit the bushveld. My grandfather had a farm on the southern boundary of Kruger National Park, and in fact, one of my earliest experiences in the bushveld was on a lion hunt, which I don't talk about with any form of pride. Lions had been killing my grandfather's cows, and we went out one afternoon and shot two of them. And I realized that day two things. A, that I was never interested in seeing animals die, and that I wouldn't follow that line of career. And B, I watched a tracker track this lion, and I was just amazed by the skill of that. And I vowed that I would come back and live a life in the Lowveld, having grown up in the Cape. And indeed, that's what I did for 25 years. So yeah, that was the beginning. I arrived at Londolozi in 1995. Are you seeing my screen?
Clearly, you look exactly the same as you did back then.
Thank you. Michael, so yeah, I arrived at Londolozi as a cadet ranger, which is basically just a fancy word for skivvy. And I painted the toilets, and I carted the camp managers around. I helped set up bush banqueting functions and all of that. But in the background, I was training to be a guide. And in those days, and indeed still to this day, Londolozi has a very intensive ranger selection program. And after a few months being a cadet ranger there, I was invited to go on the selection, and I failed it outright. I tried it again, and I failed it again. And then Shan Vati was kind enough to send me off for a bit of training at eco training. And I also, at that time, CC Africa was the company which is now called And Beyond, also had Ingala Lodge, and I spent time there. And finally, on my third attempt, I became a qualified guide at Londolozi. And this photograph here is one of the earlier, very early pictures of me as a guide. But what's significant about this picture is the other man on the front left of the bonnet of this Land Rover, and his name is Renius Mflongo. And more than any game lodge, any animal, or any piece of bushveld, this man has had the profoundest effect on my life. I will be forever indebted to him. And we have now walked a 25-year journey together. He was assigned as kind of my tracker. And like any young 19-year-old, having been put through the mill, once I'd qualified, I thought I was it. I thought I was the all-knowing, all-seeing guide. But I soon realized that going on the game drives, that in fact, Renius was the one in control. He was the one all-seeing. He was born inside what is today the Greater Kruger National Park, in a mud hut like this one underneath an ebony tree in the year of 1963. His father and his grandfather had slowly moved eastwards. They Mklongo family, originally from southern Mozambique. They'd slowly moved eastwards from the early 1900s through what was then the Sabi Game Reserve, the precursor to what is today the Kruger National Park, and living for 3 or 4 years at a time in a small abode like this one, where they would set up shop. They'd make they'd create these structures, these thatched roofs with walls made of from termite mound mud, and they'd grow vegetables. They'd have a few cows, and they'd hunt small game, and they would subsist. And it's interesting because Jane Carruthers wrote her PhD on the impact of the Shangaan people on the Lowveld upon the time that the colonial people arrived and the apartheid government started to set up the Kruger National Park, or it was actually pre-apartheid, but yeah, the nationalist government was setting up the park. And she has found that in fact, contrary to what many believe, the local people of the Lowveld were living in perfect harmony with the animals, perfect harmony. It was not until much later, when the colonial sport hunters came along, that we saw the vast, dramatic decline in animal numbers. So Renius was, him and his family call themselves Shangaan. The Shangaan and the Vatsonga people are very closely related. The difference being that the Shangaan people originated from their old patriarch, Shoshangaan, or Manukosi, who was in fact from Zululand. And so, although in fact it's interesting, Shangaan is not even a recognized dialect of Tsonga. It's not an official language of the country, but it is widely spoken. It is very, very similar to Tsonga, but there is some Zulu influence of isiZulu, both grammatically and yeah, in many ways there's an influence of the Zulu language. So Renius is a Shangaan man, and he was who I was partnered with. He's 13 years older than me. He grew up in the bush. He has no formal schooling. His father would not allow him to be taught in another language other than his own. So his job was to tend his father's cattle and goats. And so he grew up as probably one of the last people to be raised as on the original traditions of a Shangaan hunter-gatherer, Renius did. And so, long story short, I was in the hands of probably one of the most deeply versed trackers in the country. His older brother, Elmon Mklongo, and a small group, a band of other trackers from Londolozi was the team who settled the now famous Leopards of Londolozi. And I fell into the lap of this vast tacit knowledge and experience that resides with people like Renius. And I just realized that not long after getting going and in being in partnership with Ren, I realized that I was more interested in the process of finding the animals than going and sitting with a camera and photographing leopards and lions. I was far more interested in the tracking process, and it was all consuming to me. I used to go to sleep dreaming about tracks and how we would track faster and more efficiently and find more other animals than the other tracker ranger teams did. And this is an image of us looking for a pair of leopard cubs in the late 1990s. And leopards were the animals we used to target. And Ren was just fantastically, he was just so knowledgeable of leopard behavior and notwithstanding the skill to track those animals. And so we spent more time off our vehicle than on it. And I remember one of our guests wrote in a feedback form that we think the ranger should be a tracker. And another person wrote, we think that the ranger's got more interest in the tracker than he's got in us. So that just goes to show. I had more, and I started to learn. Renius started to teach me to speak Shangaan. Indeed, he could not speak much English at that time, so there was a lot of sign language going on. But we taught each other's languages starting in 1995, and we are both to this day reasonably fluent in each other's languages, and that's been a huge factor in the development of our relationship and my ability to understand René Mhlongo, the man, the human being. So we would track, and he was just red hot on leopards, to the point where there were a number of individual leopards who he could tell from the shape of their tracks. This has been studied worldwide with varying results, but there was a handful of leopards that René could tell the individual by the shape of the toes, a scar underneath the main pad, just the appearance, the size, the proportions. And he'd seen these tracks for so long on that patch of land that it became second nature to him in many ways. And I remember one of my earliest tracking expeditions was with this leopard, and she was known as the Tuguan female. She was probably 14 or 15 years of age. She lived to 16, and as far as I know, she's the oldest wild recorded leopard that we know of. Animals, as a general statement, live much older or longer lives when they live in captivity. But wild animals don't get to that because they live, they've got to fight for their meals and mates and so on. So this leopard, she was 14 at the time, and interesting, she was the granddaughter of the original mother leopard of Londolozi that René and his brothers started tracking in the late 70s and early 80s. She died in 1991, and in that time had 9 litters of cubs, all of which grew up in the presence of vehicles, and I'm going to get into what that means, but they grew up habituated, and I mean habituated, not tame, and I'll explain a little bit later what that means. But this leopard was the granddaughter of the old mother leopard, and she had a very interesting temperament. On some days, she was totally calm and relaxed, and on other days, you drive over a dry branch, and she'd look at you, and you came half a meter closer, and she'd be charging straight up to you. And I remember we had a group of 6 Canadians with us one trip, and this particular group were very, very keen to see leopards. They'd come specifically to Londolozi to see a leopard, and they were not wealthy people, because they told me how they'd saved their whole lives to come to Londolozi to see a leopard. And by the 3rd evening, we'd seen no leopard. We didn't even look like finding a leopard. And we were having a really bad, like a dry spell. And in fact, the old man of the family went to the general manager and asked if he could have another ranger tracker, because he'd lost faith in us completely. Anyway, on the last morning, later that day, they were due to fly back to Johannesburg and back to Canada. We got onto a track, onto the Tuguan female's track, this leopard's track. And we followed her, and the tracks were very, very fresh. And we followed her down into a donga, into a dry riverbed. And she walked in the sand for 500 or 600 meters. And I remember the donga made like an S bend. And as we got around the first bend, René knelt down. He said, "These tracks are fresh." He says, his English wasn't so good. He says, "These tracks have walked now." And that means these tracks are fresh. And as we got going again, a tree squirrel started to alarm about 100 meters down the donga, like that. And René said to me, "This animal's close by." I had the rifle, and he was following. This was one of the first times that I'd been on foot. It was the first time he'd shown any confidence in me joining him, because I think I was just, in his eyes, just a liability to him. And his job was to get off and track and find the animals, come back, and then call me in the vehicle with the guests to drive in. This time I was with him on foot for the first time. Anyway, long story short, we get around the corner, and this animal explodes out of the bush. I was so astounded by the power of her energy and force that she created, the energetic force that she created. I stepped back a couple of steps, and I and René was standing off to the left of me, and I never forget him saying, "Heever, Just to be Heever, wait, and I was on my back, and I was thinking, no, I can't go anywhere from here. And anyway, he talked me out of the situation. She was so close, I could smell her breath. I could see her. She was right over me, and I was certain she was going to bite me in the throat. Anyway, we survived that, and I got a bit better with dealing with big cats on foot. And in fact, later on, and as this image suggests, we actually stopped taking rifles on our walks. And Renius always said to me that it's only a mampara tracker that gets rolled over by an animal. It's not the rifle that looks after you. It's your awareness. It's your understanding of their behavior. It's your intimacy with that animal. That is your first line of protection, not a heavy caliber 4.58 rifle, which we used to carry around. So in later years, we unless we were taking guests on foot, we walked with sticks, as you can see, and that was great, because I remember that transition, because it forces you definitely do feel like you're a little bit in control when you're carrying a heavy caliber firearm. But when you don't have that, you feel a bit naked initially. Now I don't even notice it. In fact, now when I carry a rifle, I'm not used to the weight, and I'm not very good with carrying a rifle these days. And thanks to Ren, I've developed my own ability to be aware and alert. So those are the early days. One of the other leopards we followed a lot was this leopard, and she was an amazing animal. This was one of the last pictures that were taken of her. You can see her left eye in the photograph is all blue, because she was spat in the eye by a Mozambican spitting cobra. But this leopard, we had unusual success rate with this leopard. Her name was the Mangen female. Mangen is Timangen is a Shangan word, means aloes. The aloe, the aloes that they flower beautifully in the winter. And her territory was around a donga where there were lots of these aloes, hence her name Mangen. And we would follow and find her more often than any other leopard. And I remember one afternoon we tracked her down into an old quarry where they'd been mining gravel for a road, and we found her there hunting a group of little banded mongooses. And she was obviously very hungry that she was hunting mongooses in the middle of the day. And when we found her, usually what we would do, you'd find the leopard, hopefully it wouldn't see you, and you immediately back off and you go and fetch the vehicle and you bring the guests into. That's the process. On this particular occasion, Ren said to me, let's stay with her, let's walk with her. And that's what we did. We spent an hour and a half walking with this leopard. Every now and then she'd look back and look at us, but she showed no aggression. She didn't run from us. She didn't try and walk faster. And the more time, we started at like 100 meters, then we were at 80 meters, then we were at 60 meters. At one stage, Michael, we were no more than 20 or 30 meters from her. As she was going about her business, a vulture descended on the horizon. I watched her notice that. A bird, a starling, started to alarm off to the right. I noticed her get irritated with that and lift her tail. And the leopards lift their tail and they expose the white under their tail, almost as a way of saying, well, I'm not hunting you, just shut up. You're giving me away here. I visibly saw that irritation towards that starling. We got into the life of this animal. It culminated with her starting to stalk a grey duiker. And here, this leopard was stalking a duiker, and Renius and I, 15 meters behind her, also stalking on our hands the same duiker. There was this strange human-animal band of hunters together focused on this duiker. She never once reacted. And eventually, she got so close to this duiker, and we were all so close, Ren and I realized we were probably going to mess up the hunt for her, and so we backed off. And as we were backing off, she rushed, but she missed that duiker. I think we may have missed it for her. Anyway, this leopard, thereafter, this is no word of a lie. We'd be driving in our vehicle with guests. She'd come out of the bush. She'd see us. She'd turn. She'd come towards us, and she'd make a chuffing sound. And I never knew what that was. And she never did it to anyone else. And I asked leopard researchers in Kruger National Park. I asked John Varty. No one really knew what it was. John eventually told me that his tigers chuff to, that's called chuffing. They chuff to greet. And I can only assume that the Mungin female could recognize Renius and I, and we had an unbelievable relationship, a kinship with this animal, which I'll go to my grave with this. I mean, she's in my heart for the rest of my life. So that was, and yeah, so that was life with Ren in the bush as a guide at Londolozi. We were very lucky. Londolozi is one of the few places that fostered tracking, and so we were encouraged to get off and to make use of the ancient craft of tracking to find animals and to involve the guests, because I find it utterly boring to just get a radio call and drive up to a bunch of sleeping lions and take a few pictures. To me, there's nothing in that. That's not, Africa doesn't work like that. You got to get it. You got to work for your sightings, I believe, and you got to use the skill and the mastery of the tracker to get close. So that's what I was very fortunate to have. And as life went on, we started to have this conversation about how do we preserve the next generation of trackers, because when Ren and his ilk go, and that generation, when they pass on, we're going to lose all of it. And so we started to have a conversation about starting a tracking school. And our dream came to reality in 2010, when, courtesy of Gaynor Rupert, who founded and funded the Tracker Academy, we started a school to train wildlife trackers as professional practitioners. We founded the Tracker Academy in 2010. We accepted our first 8 students. We decided to choose the hyena as our logo because of a number of reasons. I was pretty certain no school, organization, NGO in the world would want a hyena as their logo. I'd taken this photograph of a hyena and I'd simply outlined it. Some people have said that's great branding, and how did you get that right? It was just a photograph that we traced and slapped the name on the bottom. Essentially, what the Tracker Academy does is that, funded by Mrs. Gaynor Rupert and the Rupert Family Foundations, and subsequently we've been very lucky to have other donors come in and join our donor community. But we are totally donor reliant. We now train 24 young, rural, unemployed men and women from rural villages, mostly living adjacent to wildlife areas, in traditional skills of tracking. And we then, once they're with us for a year full time, and then we deploy them in conservation jobs. We have 3 bases. Samara, which was our original base in the Karoo, Samara Game Reserve near Graaff-Reinet. Then we started at Londolozi, and the Vati family were very kind, like Samara, the Tompkins family, to give us the land and facilities to operate for free of charge. And then 2.5 years ago, we started at Swalu Kalahari Reserve. So we have 3 campuses, and we switch students around those campuses. It's a 1-year full-time program. We are the only formally accredited tracker training school in Africa, and we're the only tracker training school in the world that enjoys formal recognition by its country's Department of Education, being the Sector Education Training Authority, the CETA. And so we train students from the whole of the SADC region, including Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique. We're going to be accepting 2 students from Rwanda next year. And it's fantastic because Samara's in the semi-desert Karoo, Londolozi's in the traditional bushveld, and Swalu, of course, in the Kalahari, where the San people are, and which is maybe the heart and soul of trackers and tracking in Africa. And it's just the 3 wonderful, wonderful bases with which to conduct our training operations. We deal with 8 students per group. And we have 2 trainers to 8, so our teacher training ratio is pretty high, which most people would be happy with, although sometimes it's a difficult one for me to explain to a funder out of the US who doesn't understand why we have to have 2 teachers per 8 students, but we need that for safety reasons and legal reasons. When you go walking in a Big 5 area, you have to have a lead and an assistant taking people on foot. We obviously, practical tracking skills is the core of the course, but we also teach guiding, we teach animal monitoring, man tracking, the theory of tracking. They do specialist birding, they do basic rifle competency, they do all of that, and it's a fully sponsored program. This image is actually, these certificates are their specialist birding certificates that they do in partnership with Joe Grossel. It's important to mention that recently we started to take lady students, female trackers as well. That when we became accredited with the CETA, they stipulated that we had to have separate accommodation and ablution facilities if we were to take ladies. So that was a structural limitation that prevented us from taking women initially. But when we expanded into Swalu, the facilities allowed for that. So now we take lady trackers as well. And we've had some, this lady on the right is from Botswana, and she finished second from the top of her class in 2018. So if I'm to get back into the explanation of what tracking is, broadly speaking, tracking very broadly speaking, has 2 components. The one is what we call the track and sign identification, or track and sign interpretation. And the other is what we call trailing, the skill to follow an animal's trail and eventually find it. The image that's on your screens now is of our students practicing their ability to identify animal tracks and signs. And we teach from insect tracks to elephant tracks. In this instance, they're studying a spotted eagle owl's track. And we will want to know the difference between a spotted eagle owl and a giant eagle owl, and why. And the students need to learn the differences. They need to be able to explain the differences, write down the differences, draw them. So because they're with us for a year, we have a lot of time to really go deep into the technical ability of identifying. And if tracking were a language, the small tracks, the track and sign identification component, would be in a way the alphabet, the ABC, that you have to learn the alphabet before you can read the language. So this is the ABC in some ways, and the trailing is the reading of the language. In this photograph, we've got a hare's track, and as I was saying earlier, in the Kalahari, the conditions are just so beautiful. The soil is just so perfectly conducive for tracking, and that's why tracking probably started in that region, because you can see tracks. This is a student studying a tortoise track. They need to know the difference between the tortoise and the terrapin, and we spend hours and hours and hours studying, looking, teaching, coaching, and every month they get assessed and we track their performance. This is just quite an interesting little snapshot of 4 pug marks of a lioness track on the left and a lion on the right. I'm not sure. You can actually, from this picture, you can, from such a limited view of an animal's tracks, you can tell quite a lot what's going on. And Michael, can you tell what's going on here?
Look, to be honest, initially I thought it was a dog's print, but thanks for clearing that up. Maybe they've stopped, maybe they're mating. I'm not sure why there would be one print over the other print. That would be my guess, now that you told me there's a lioness and a lion.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, I mean, the fact that you've said the word stop shows that you can see there's a difference there. The lioness, and let me see if I can get this annotate working here. Let me see if I can get this to work. The lioness, you'll see, this is her hind foot over here. And this is her front foot. The hind foot is partially registered on top of her front foot. That tells us that this lioness is walking at a medium pace. Whereas on the male lion over here, that's his front foot there, and and all the way over here is his hind foot. And you can see there's this gap here. And that gap tells you that the animal is striding out. So it's walking faster than the lioness. And you would not have lions walking together, but at different paces. So, and then upon further investigation, we could see that the lioness's tracks were older than the males. And we realized that something had happened, that the lionesses had gone first, and the male was coming in behind them, and he was coming at pace. He wasn't running, but he was walking briskly, and he was coming to link up with them. And there can only be two reasons why a male is following a female, and that's in the lion world anyway, and that is for food or for mating. And in this instance, these lionesses had killed a zebra, and that male arrived about an hour later, chased the lions off, and ate most of the zebra on his own. And so what's important here to illustrate is that you can tell so much from you can interpret so much of behavior from just such a small little snapshot like that. Yeah. Okay. So let me just.
Alex, a question was coming through. Do you only take students from Africa, or also international students as well?
We only take rural, previously disadvantaged people from Africa. Yeah. Yes. Yes. So, and here's an image of Renius teaching some really experienced trackers in Malawi who work for African Parks Network in Majete National Park. These guys are they're rhino monitors, and I've witnessed some of the best trailing skills I've ever seen amongst this group of men. Yet, when we started to ask them a track of a mongoose or a bird or an insect or an antelope, they didn't have much knowledge. So it was clear that they had dedicated much of their efforts in only one area of tracking, and that's limiting. And so we open the world of track and sign identification to them, and that's really just taking them through. I don't even remember what that track was anymore. So the other component, we've dealt with the track and sign identification. The other component is the trailing, and that's the skill that takes the longest to learn. To follow a rhino's, for example, a rhino's footprint until you find that beast over varying terrains, hard soil, thick bush, old evidence, incomplete information, hot sun, over long distances is tiring and difficult. It's challenging. I personally think tracking represents some of the most complex problem solving that we have. And I'm fascinated to learn more about how expert trackers and master trackers process their information, because the track and sign very much is detail-oriented left brain, whereas the trailing is a mixture of the left and the right brain, being the creative, innovative, bigger picture, pattern-forming, speculative part of the decision-making process. And so, as I said, trailing is difficult. It takes a long time. The other thing that's interesting is that I've noticed that when we teach students, and Renius and I have spent time with teaching trackers from a variety of people, from wealthy American first world people all the way to the poor people. We have found that those who have been through a high quality Western education model usually perform quite well on the track and sign identification. People, that proportions, measurements, size, shapes comes naturally to them. But when you switch them and you ask them to follow a rhino, they struggle. And the opposite is true of people that have not had, when I say the benefit, I don't know if it is a benefit of Western education in this context. They do well at the trailing, but they struggle on the track and sign. But in summary, our students, this is a young guy tracking a black rhino practicing at Samara. The trailing is a wonderful skill. You've got to be technically smart. You've got to have a solid technical foundation, because it's from deep technical competence that the creativity flows. You can't just get into start tracking. And I've spoken to a friend of mine actually yesterday about who's an artist, and he was telling me about the technical competence that goes into becoming an artist before you can start to realize your creative genius. And these guys are artists in many ways. Here is a small group of 3 expert trackers tracking a leopard at Londolozi. And, a leopard's pug mark is no bigger than this. And even in beautiful soft sand, you still may not see a leopard's track very clearly. Notwithstanding when it walks over this kind of terrain where the soil is quite hard. You really have to use your imagination to see a print on the ground, to be able to recognize that there's evidence, and then be able to interpret that evidence, and then assimilate that with what is the animal doing. So from the evidence, you start to interpret what is the animal doing. And then the third part of the process is, how does that all fit into the larger environment? So I'll give you an example. If you're tracking a leopard, and the tracks are from last night, and the tracks head into an area where there's thickets with bushbuck, there's a good chance that she's hunting. You can start to piece together what the detail of the track is telling you, what you know about leopard behavior, and the structure of the landscape all come together in a 3-way assimilated model that helps you to build a mental picture of the animal's activity. And then that's what the tracker does. He doesn't see every piece of evidence all the time. He's got this imagination where he's constantly piecing together, as the information becomes available to him, what the animal is doing, overlaying that on what he knows and understands of the animal's behavior, and then overlaying that on what how the structure of the landscape, the physical structure of the environment, is having an influence on the animal's movement. And they piece that together, they create hypotheses, and then they test them. And tracking is a chain of many predictions, constantly tracking, losing the tracks, getting back on, losing the tracks again. And it's a process, and it's tiring, and it takes a long time to learn. And I remember the early days, I got very frustrated with it. And rhino, in fact, are some of the easiest animals to follow, and probably the reason why they get poached. And they're great to learn to track on. So when we started Tracker Academy, there was no training curriculum for us to use. There were no textbooks other than publicly available field guides. So we wrote our own textbook called the Tracker Manual, which we used for a number of years. And then a few years ago, we published it with Straight Nature. So it's now available for the general public. And pretty much a lot, even since writing that book, the content is bulged. But in that book is how we teach tracking, the practical component of track and sign and trailing to our students. As I was saying, our students go through our year with us at Tracker Academy, and then we deploy them in jobs. Since 2010, we've had 170 trackers graduate from Tracker Academy, of which close to 90% are today in permanent conservation jobs, all of whom were unemployed, many of whom were without hope. And this is an example. A lot of our students go into animal monitoring, and this is a young guy who was monitoring, in this instance, aardvark, and he did such a great job at tracking and finding this particular aardvark that he developed a relationship with it. It was the most amazing thing. And so it just shows you, there's so many examples to prove that this ancient craft of tracking has relevance in modern conservation efforts. And that is Tracker Academy's out and out agenda, is to prove that this ancient indigenous African skill still has relevance, notwithstanding the collars and technology and satellite and all the wonderful things that are going on around conservation. But I still think boots on the ground trackers have a lot of value to add. So animal monitoring is one sector of the conservation industry that our students go into. This is another one. obviously with the spike in poaching in 2008 of the rhino, we've had a lot of requests of our students to go into anti-poaching units. I've worked with a lot of these anti-poaching units, and I've actually been astounded at the stark lack of genuine tracking skills within our anti-poaching units in Southern Africa. Are they militarily well trained? Absolutely. Do they know guns? Absolutely. Tactics? Yes. Can they track? I have a big question mark. And so there are those who can, but this was a graduate of ours who graduated, went into anti-poaching following a career, and then was trained as a dog handler. And I think that they made a fantastic team, because you've got the dog who can track and the human that can track too. So to me, that would make a formidable pair. And so that was Bongani, and we've had a lot of students go into the and they're making waves in the units that they go into. The third area of the conservation industry that is taking our graduates, are obviously ecotourism lodges like Londolozi, Samara, Pinda, Swalu, trackers to find animals for guests. And so we have been very fortunate. Tracker Academy falls into what we call further education and training. And if you examine that industry, the global average is about 55 to 60% of further education training graduates find employment. We're at 90%. So we're very happy with that. And that's a statistic I continue to boast about, because, and in many ways, that's where the rubber meets the road, It's no use training people for the sake of training, or because you like tracking, or you've got funding to teach people about IT. They have to be able to use those skills and apply them to improve their lives. And people have said, we've had offers to expand Tracker Academy, but my view is, instead of going wider, is we rather go deeper, and we deepen the training experience and the quality of our training operation. So this is two leopards at Londolozi. Another interesting area that has come as an unintended consequence of Tracker Academy's work is what we call predator habituation. And that is the process whereby you form a relationship with a wild animal for the benefit of a tourism operation. Like Londolozi did in the 1970s, and Renius and his brothers and a couple of others did in the 70s and 80s, where they started to track leopards. At that time, no lodge could guarantee you could see a leopard. It was only after refined, tenacious tracking skills. Those trackers founded an entire industry, Michael. They're not just trackers who did, they were contributors to an entire industry. And the ecotourism industry is the fastest growing in Southern Africa. And no one says anything about the trackers. And you can hear, I believe that they've had a profound impact on where ecotourism has gone, especially in areas like the South African lowveld. So would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, you talked about habituation earlier. What did you actually mean by that? Because often people might get confused seeing these cats so used to people and vehicles.
Yes. So and that's a good question, and thank you for asking it, because it's an important one. It can be misinterpreted easily. The process of habituation is not taming the animal. Your dog or your cat at home is tame. It no longer behaves like a wild cat or a wild dog used to. It has been fundamentally and profoundly, its behavior has been changed by human beings, domesticated animals. An habituated leopard or habituated lion, tiger, bear still continues to behave 100% naturally, except it allows people and vehicles to come close to it. These two leopards here were mating. Their mating process was totally undisturbed. Londolozi and many of the other private game reserves in Southern Kruger National Park do not record losing leopards to poachers just because they're habituated. if you approach that leopard on foot, you're still going to, barring the Mangian female story I told you earlier, you're still going to get a natural response, which will either be aggression, they'll come at you wanting to tell you to move away or even attack you in some instances, or they're going to slink away and you won't even see them. Habituation, all that means is that they've accepted that these human beings, these vehicles, do not threaten us. And so Tracker Academy started to help using what Ren and his team did at Londo's in the 70s and 80s to help other game reserves, not only in South Africa and in Africa, but in fact, even in other continents. And that's where I'm going to go next with this little presentation. Is our first habituation project we ran, in fact, was in Brazil, in the Pantanal region of Brazil, which is a massive wetland. I think it's the biggest wetland in the world, the second biggest wetland in the world. It looks very similar to the Okavango Delta in its structure. The owners of a place called the Cayman Ecological Refuge in the Pantanal, where they just built 2 very fancy 5-star lodges, came and spent time with Tracker Academy. And one morning we took them tracking lions, and our students found the lions, and these guys were just amazed at the skill that they observed from our trackers, and the fact that we actually could find the lions. They didn't believe we could actually do it. They thought you had to have collars and so on. And he turned to me in the bush, this fellow from Brazil, and he said, "Do you think you can do the same with jaguars? We need our jaguars to be like your leopards and lions." And I said to him, "Absolutely," not knowing what I was getting into. So within a week or two, Renius and I found ourselves in the Pantanal. And it was just an amazing amazing environment. It looks like Renius is holding my hand here with this giant anteater that we found whilst tracking a jaguar. But long story short, we deployed these 2 young men, Andreas Sitoli and Richard Ntabin, both from rural villages in Mpumalanga, and they'd never been outside. They'd been to Hazy View, never mind Johannesburg, never mind fly across the world to Sao Paulo and go into Brazil and track an animal they'd never seen before. But they were up for it, and they were 2 top graduates from their respective groups, and we deployed them to Cayman, where they started tracking the jaguars, and they had remarkable results. This was a young male that they started to track, and they found him quite regularly. And at the time, the lodges in Cayman recorded that only 5% of their guests saw jaguars. This was 5 years ago that we started this project. I got a Christmas card from the owner last Christmas reporting proudly that 72% of his guests are now seeing jaguar, largely because of the tracking efforts and the habituation efforts. And that is now, Cayman has now become a model for ecotourism in the Pantanal. You can imagine every landowner in that whole area now wants to sell his cattle and get into ecotourism because of the successes that Cayman has enjoyed. And it just shows you, again, it's another example of the value of traditional skills of tracking. But it's also an example of South Africa exporting a skill, which, as Gaynor Rupert said to me, we don't export a lot of skills, but this is a sure sign example of one that we do, and where we've helped another country in a conservation sense through tracking. So that was Brazil, and that project has gone very well. We've trained local trackers in Brazil that are taking over the project from us, and it's been a huge success. Another project that we've run projects now in Rwanda, Botswana, all over the place, helping private game reserves to habituate leopards and lions and various predators. One very ambitious project that we are about to embark on is in Chile, in the Patagonia region of Chile, just adjacent to the Torres de Paine National Park. Renius and I went there last year, I think it was August, to go and establish whether it was going to be possible to do it. And we spent 10 days there, and there we were looking for Puma, mountain lions. Those mountains in the background that you can see, those are the three famous turrets of the Torres de Paine Massif, and that's the national park. So we were in a concession that was a sheep farm, essentially, an ailing, half-bankrupt sheep farm that's wanting to turn, or it has turned, to ecotourism, and they want to know if we can help them. But I can tell you, I have not tracked in such difficult terrain before. That ground is frozen. That day that photograph was taken, it was like -7 or something. I've never been so cold. But just a few minutes after that photograph was taken, we saw some condors come down, descending out of the sky. We went to investigate. We found where a sheep had been killed, and Renius started to follow. We found one pug mark at the sheep's carcass, which confirmed that this sheep had been killed by a puma. And we started, and Renius kind of picked a route. He asked the guide, where's the water, where's the national park, and we kind of oriented ourselves, and we picked a route half in the direction of where this one pug mark was facing. About 10 minutes later, we got another pug mark, but very, very faint, very faint. About 15 minutes later, I found a piece of bloodied sheep's fur that had dropped from the puma's mouth. And then Renius went into a mode I had never seen him go into before. This was his most ultimate tracking challenge. And long story short, he found that puma after about 3 hours of tracking. And, Ian McCullum was telling me that in sports, in the sports industry or sports field, there's often a game where a player becomes a great player. And I believe Renius Mhlongo became a great tracker in the mountains of Patagonia just last August. That after 40 years of tracking. So that was in Chile. And a few days later, we spent some time in another area where we managed to find, just near the road, in fact, this, I don't know if you can see in the background, there's it was a mother puma with her 3 youngsters that we found and spent time with, and just in the few hours we were on foot with them, they started to relax. And it just goes to show how quickly these animals are prepared to form a relationship with humans if you know how to do so, and if you respect them. You're prepared to be compassionate when you're around them on foot. You always must be aware of their signs, what they're telling you, their body language. And it's actually not rocket science. It just takes a lot of time. So that's predator habituation. And it's, as I said, it's become an unintended consequence of Tracker Academy. And it's the work I love the most, in fact. Another project that we got involved in 2 years ago was a fossil tracks project. We have established that crocodiles, large reptiles, and we think it's a crocodile because the tracks look pretty similar to our modern day, or so-called modern day crocodile. Crocodiles are millions of years old. That image on the left is actually a front foot of a crocodile, front right foot of a crocodile. And that track was made about 100,000 years ago on the Cape South Coast near Sedgefield. And we published together with our co-authors a scientific paper in the South African Journal of Science that shows very strongly that crocodiles occurred along the South Cape coast. And the conditions must have been different. They must have been warmer at the time, which does throw into question, are we, the warming phase we're going through now, clearly the humans have had an impact and are accelerating it, but we have been through warm phases before. And there's no ways crocodiles could survive in today's climate in the South Cape coast. So that was another project we do, and it's very much in my ambit of my work with Tracker Academy is looking for projects to show the legitimacy of tracking as a skill, and as well as the credibility of Tracker Academy as an education and training institute. So that's pretty much it. Michael, I'll end with Renius and I recently published a book called Changing a Leopard Spots. It has 3 themes to it. Obviously, our 25-year relationship, which has had, I'll be honest, we've had some challenges, we've had some difficulties that we've had to overcome. We come from polarized backgrounds. We come with baggage, both of us, and we've worked through those. The book explains how we got through those. It tells many of the stories, the adventures we've had all around the world tracking animals. So it's autobiographical. It's tracking, but to me, its greatest value is it talks about the human condition. And I think South Africans should read it, because if 2 ordinary guys like Renius and I can form a productive relationship like we have, I think South Africa as a whole has a huge, huge potential. If we can just put our stuff behind us, reconcile, acknowledge that each one of us has deep-seated prejudices. Every single one of us, we carry prejudices, at least prejudices, in the best case, worst case, outright racism, but we can heal. And the best way to do that is one-on-one, from a person, from a culture different to you. And so that's the book. It was published in March this year. My publisher tells me it's the worst time to publish a book since the Second World War. So I don't know. We'll see how well it does. We'll see how well it does. It's in most of the bookstores around the country. And then I'll end off with Ren and I together with 2 partners, Grant Ashfield and of Leadership Works, and another friend of ours, Ian Schubach, who lives in Australia, have created a virtual tracking experience that uses the metaphor of tracking to assist organizations with tracking their goals and getting them onto a path of performance, but using the old ancient art and metaphor of tracking, which, as it turns out, every single human is born to track. We've become too focused, too linear. We need to get softer. We need to be a bit more alert, have more time to be observant. The signs are around us as to where we should be moving in our lives, both professionally and personally. And Tracking Success is a virtually delivered program, and it helps people to get onto the path of success. Track your own success. Yeah. And that's all I have for now. I know it's been a bit of a whirlwind presentation. I think I've gone over time. But
Thank you, Alex. That was really, really interesting. And we're just very proud of the brilliant work you're doing as South Africans, exporting this knowledge all over the world. The incredible success rate of employment statistics. I mean, I don't know any other training facility that can say 90% of their graduates have permanent jobs. If you do have questions, ready if you're coming through. I know we have gone over our hour, but if you would like to stay on and ask a few questions, you're more than welcome to. Someone did ask whether we are recording this for his son to watch later. Yes, we are recording this, but we're getting a lot of questions coming through here. One of the questions was, do your graduates, are they able to use this tracking skill outside the conservation world, or are all of the jobs in the conservation sector, Alex?
So far, all of the jobs have been in the conservation sector. Having said that, we've had quite a few of our graduates that have started their own companies, taking people on walks and doing some consulting, using tracking as the theme. But I would say that the overwhelming bulk is in the conservation industry. Yeah.
And just while I'm reading through these questions, did you find any difference of those people who did well? You had some underprivileged students that came from rural areas, but also some from informal settlements. And was there any difference in someone who'd spent more time in an urban environment doing less well than someone who's, been looking after goats or sheep or something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you've been looking after goats or sheep or cattle or if you've lived a life of a hunter-gatherer, you clearly have an advantage coming onto the program. And we see that advantage. But we've had numerous examples of young guys. One guy I can remember from Crossroads in Cape Town. Is it Crossroads? Yeah. The big township Crossroads. He had not seen a wild animal, let alone its tracks. He ended up at the top of his class, Michael Tweke. And he just had a great work ethic. He had the ability to switch between detail and big picture. And he was imaginative. He was prepared to speculate. He came into it with quite a good deal of personal power. So he had like some natural confidence that he could learn this. But it was just proof that any one of us, irrespective of our background, can learn to become a really competent tracker. Yeah.
I just got Rivalelo who's put up his hand or her hand. I'm just going to allow to ask the question. Can you hear us?
Yes, hello.
Good evening.
Good evening, how are you?
Good, thank you. You can go ahead.
So I was listening, so I heard it so interesting, and most of the people he was talking about, they are more. I'm from the place where they are situated, like Raymond, Elmone, and Renias. So I would like to know how difficult or how easy, how to enroll in that trekking academy, because I've been wanting to enroll there, but I couldn't get enough information on how to.
Thank you for your question. Thank you for your question. Alex, I know you have a huge amount of interest every year. Maybe you could talk through that and how people would be able to apply if they are interested.
Yes, sure. So we only take 24 a year in 3 groups, 2 intakes in Jan, 1 intake in June. We have between 600 and 900 applications a year. Revalero, what you must do is go onto our website, www.trackeracademy.co.za. You will see the contacts page there. Just complete the contacts page and it'll come to one of us and we will be in contact with you. Very soon, next month, we're going to have a fully online application system on our website. You'll be able to do the full application online. Get our website.
Thanks, Alex. How many master trackers are left in the world? And are you also working with other parts of the world? Someone was writing that in India, this ancient art is dying out. You mentioned before in another talk that it's 10,000 hours minimum to get there. I know you spend 1,000 hours in your training. So could you answer that question about master trackers and are you working with other parts of the world with other master trackers if they exist?
Yeah, so there is no formal assessment that will qualify you as a master tracker. There are groups of people that get together and decide who they believe should receive a master tracker certificate. And that usually is someone who's shown new, novel contribution to the current knowledge of tracking or has done some exceptional tracking work. So there are expert and master trackers all around the world. I must say, though, they are concentrated in southern and eastern Africa. I have spent time on pretty much in Australia, South America, North America, Asia, and I have not come across the level of skill that I've encountered, and that's not being biased. The level of skill that I've witnessed firsthand in southern Africa. Are they out there? Absolutely, they must be. Can they be trained? Definitely. And do they have an aptitude? For sure. But we are working, obviously, in South America. We've worked in North America, and we have recently had a request to help train Aboriginal field rangers in Australia as well, which hopefully we'll start doing in the medium term. Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. We've got so many congratulations on your great talk. We've even got a request for you to do some work in India, which I'll forward you those details. Just a quick question. Have you done any work in Colombia? at this point in South America?
No, we have not. No.
Great. Well, look, I thank you again for taking your time. That was really wonderful. I urge everyone to go out there and buy your book and prove everyone wrong that this is in fact a great time to read. We have time. We are at home. Thank you for 150 of you joining us this evening and taking the time. I remind you that next week we've got another great talk, using nature to fight nature, all about owls and bats. And if you would like to correspond with Alex, you can find his details on the Tracker Academy. Please buy his book. This will be recorded, so please share this webinar with as many people as you can. And thank you again, Alex, for inspiring us. I really want to get out there and start tracking myself and have a look at what's happening around. Even when we go for a walk on the beach, just follow a dog track or a seagull. But have a wonderful evening, and thank you everyone from tuning in from all over the world. We've had people from South America, and I know I keep saying good evening, but I'm sure it's morning for a lot of you. So thank you again, and thank you, Alex.
Pleasure. Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for listening. All the very best.